I'm Mohammad Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. And I'm delighted to know that Dr. Mir-Djalali has joined us today here. I welcome you all to today's session of the Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series featuring Professor Daniel Sheffield of Princeton University, who will be speaking on Pragmatic Zoroastrian Theology. I'm grateful to my colleagues, Professor Enrico Raffaelli and Professor Miguel Toledo, for co-convening the series. I would like to express my gratitude to our collaborators, the Federation of Zoroastrian Association of North America, Zoroastrian Society of Ontario, Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation, and of course, the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute for enabling the establishment of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. At the outset, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Miguel Toledo, will introduce our speaker, Professor Sheffield. Professor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Daniel Sheffield, a long colleague and friend in Zoroastrian studies for many years and for many years to come. Professor Daniel Sheffield is Associate Professor of Iranian Studies and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Studies, Princeton University. He's a scholar of the intellectual and social history of the Persian-speaking world and a specialist in the early modern history of the Zoroastrians of Iran and Western India. He's the author of the forthcoming books, Cosmopolitan Zarathustras, Translating Zoroastrianism in Iran and South Asia, and Bizirkar-i Deenik, Zoroastrian Scholarship in the Pahlavi Book of Religious Decrees. He is currently conducting research for a project on Encyclopedia of Comparative Religion, completed near Hyderabad in 1650, and he's editing a corpus of Persian and Gujarati language letters and legal documents belonging to the Parsi Anjuman of Navsari. Again, please welcome Professor Daniel Sheffield. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Miguel Angel. Thank you so much, Muhammad. And thank you so much to the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute at the University of Toronto for hosting me for this virtual talk. I'm joining you all from Princeton, New Jersey. And it's such a wonderful, moment to just come together on Zoom again. I think we all became very tired of Zoom during the pandemic period, but it's moments like this in which our community can come together from around the world that we can really come to appreciate what it is that Zoom can enable. And so it's really a pleasure to be here to speak to you guys about some of my research today. I'm going to go ahead and share my talk, and as I do that, seeing, sorry, one second, hearing Professor Tavakkoli acknowledge the land that the University of Toronto is situated on. I think it is also, a necessity in speaking about the terrible impact of the smallpox disease that I too should mention that I here at Princeton University am speaking from the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape people, and we are, eternally grateful to them for shepherding and caring for the land that we are now so fortunate to be able to share And we also hope that they too will be able in some way or another to return and have some kind of experience of homecoming to this land. It is a project about pandemics and vaccination that I'm going to be presenting today in the next 40 minutes or so. Therefore, it is especially appropriate that this project be delivered via Zoom. Of course, this is a project that really began in earnest for me during those dark months in 2020, in which a cloud of uncertainty hung over my family's head, and I'm sure over the heads of many of those who are present in this audience. This project on the history of public health in India and as it connects to the history of the Parsi community and its experience of modernity and encounter with colonialism is an offshoot of a chapter of my forthcoming book that Miguel Angel so kindly referred to in introducing me, a book called Cosmopolitan Zarathustra's Translating Zoroastrianism in Iran and in Western India, a book in which in the sort of last section of the book, I am interested in precisely how Zoroastrianism comes to encounter modernity with all of its sort of global structures and all of its technologies, and ultimately positions itself in such a way that individual Zoroastrians as well as Zoroastrian organizations become very successful adopters of colonial technology and very successful navigators of the colonial state. This project in particular led me to the man who is shown hopefully now on everyone's screen, a priest who was active during the latter half of the 18th century, that is the 1700s, and the first half of the 19th century, known as Mulla Firuz. Even if you're not, familiar with Mulla Firuz himself, anyone who really knows the Zoroastrian community of Bombay, the Parsi community, will at least be familiar with Mulla Firuz's name through the various institutions which continue to bear it, namely the Mulla Firuz Library, now a part of the K.R. Kamla Oriental Institute in Bombay, the former Mulla Firuz Madrasa, which has been similarly incorporated into the currently existing Zoroastrian teaching institutions in the city, and a number of memorials which continue to exist to Mulla Firuz, especially in Kadni fire temples in Bombay, the Dadi Sadatesh Behram and others. This is a figure who was extraordinarily well known in the city during the early 19th century, often described as the most learned of the native population of Bombay, who I will be speaking about today. I first came to know about Mulla Firuz's contribution to the earliest campaign to conduct vaccination against the smallpox disease, thanks to an email that I received from my dear colleague at the British Library, Ursula Sims-Williams, about 12 years ago in 2011, as I was finishing up my dissertation. Ursula knew that I was interested in Mulla Firuz as a part of my dissertation, that I had written about Mulla Firuz's experiences as a child in Iran and had published an article about that, and that I was further interested in Mulla Firuz and his encounter and contributions to the publishing industry in Bombay in the early part of the 19th century. And I got this curious email from Ursula saying, "Dear Dan, do you know about this?" So, sincerely, Ursula, with a little attachment to a library catalog record about a manuscript in the British Library, apparently written by Mulla Firuz, arguing for the permissibility of vaccination in the Zoroastrian religion and dated to the year 1806. Indeed, I did not know about that book written in Persian, and a short book, 10 pages, composed in Persian, because as far as I knew, and as far as I continue to know, no scholar, whether Western or Indian, or Iranian for that matter, has, to the best of my knowledge, looked at this book in any sort of substantial kind of way. But at the time, the text was difficult. I wasn't working specifically on the history of science or the history of public health. It was written in Shikaste script, which is, for anyone who knows Persian, is a rather difficult script to read. And so I set it aside in my sort of mental Rolodex of texts, thinking that perhaps someday I would return to it. Of course, in the year 2020, when all of our research trips, that we had planned, for ourselves during that fateful spring and summer, ground to a halt in the light of lockdown and pandemic, I think I, like many of my colleagues, turned to the files on my hard drive to see what I had still lying around that I might be able to resuscitate for kind of a new project. And it was there that I again stumbled upon this short Persian treatise by Mulla Firuz about smallpox vaccination and Zoroastrianism. All of a sudden, vaccination and public health had a kind of a new significance, a new meaning, and I thought that this might be an interesting project to dive into. So it's with that sort of brief justification of the project and a sort of explanation of how I've come into it that I'll begin today in earnest. For much of our audience, which as I can tell is largely but not entirely Parsi and Zoroastrian, the relationship of the modern Zoroastrian community to the history of global vaccination campaigns and the history of vaccination in general will be an immediately obvious relationship. That is to say that today, in 2023, the largest manufacturer of vaccines by dose anywhere on the planet can be found in India, in Pune, in Maharashtra, namely the Serum Institute of India. Even if you've never heard of the Serum Institute of India, you've surely heard of the vaccines which this institute produces. In the COVID period, the Serum Institute collaborated with Oxford and with AstraZeneca to develop a COVID vaccine. This is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, Covishield, as it's sold, as it's known in various places. And in addition to the manufacture of this very widespread treatment for COVID prevention, the Serum Institute also manufactures a number of other vaccines today that are used for treatment of COVID. Of course, the Serum Institute of India was founded by a Parsi, an extraordinarily wealthy Parsi, one of the most wealthy persons in India and indeed in the world today, namely Cyrus Poonawalla in the year 1966. Here is Poonawalla wearing a dugli together with the late Dadi Mistry of Delhi at the World Zoroastrian Congress inauguration in Mumbai of 2013. And though Cyrus is no longer the CEO of the Serum Institute, it is still administered by his son, a Parsi, Adar Poonawalla, who was very much in the news during the COVID period. So today, the relationship of the Zoroastrian community of India to the global vaccine industry is clear. I became, interested in studying the vaccine treatise of Mulla Firuz to understand better how the Zoroastrian community came to accept the practices of colonial, ultimately European and Western medicine from a position in which prior to the 18th and early part of the 19th century, most Zoroastrians would have reacted to practices of inoculation via exposure to disease matter with horror. How does a community transition from seeing disease matter as somehow fundamentally polluting to somehow fundamentally beneficial? What kinds of theological moves and interpretive moves were priests engaged in taking in order to sort of make that transition? We'll come to those theological moves in a few minutes, but first let me just briefly outline, provide a brief account of the history of the development of the first vaccine, right? The word vaccine itself refers to the scientific name of the cowpox virus, vaccina, which was used as a form of preparing the body to defend itself against a much more deadly virus, namely the smallpox virus. So let's talk briefly about practices with regard to smallpox inoculation here. The smallpox disease, which today is functionally eradicated across the entirety of the globe, is one of the deadliest diseases known in human history. Smallpox as a disease is endemic to Eurasia and is known across, both Eurasia and Africa, and is known both to have caused, major devastation in epidemic form in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia at various points in human history over the course of some 4 millennia. It seems that the earliest references to smallpox already occur in Egyptian language documents. Smallpox is both endemic as a disease and epidemic in South Asia, meaning that it both exists at a low level, more or less at all times, and in all periods of South Asian history up until the period of its elimination in the 1970s. But it also flares up in epidemic form and periodic and particularly devastating disease outbreaks. Smallpox is a disease which causes the skin of the body to erupt in pustules, often in which number in the hundreds and thousands, apparently an incredibly painful disease, as well as an incredibly virulent disease, one that spreads very rapidly from person to person. It results in a high rate of infant mortality, and even for those children who contract the disease who survive. The debilitating scarring caused by the appearance of the individual pox often results in lifelong disability, including severe cases, outbreaks of blindness. As I've said, smallpox as a disease has been recognized as such, as an individual disease for a very long time. It's difficult to say exactly when it was first recognized as a distinct disease within India. But among Hindu communities, the disease of smallpox is associated with practices relating to the goddess, specifically the goddess in her incarnation as Sitla Devi, who you can see depicted on the slide to the right in a painting from the late 19th century. It's the smallpox is first differentiated in medical treatises in Eurasia as being distinct from other forms of pox-related diseases, such as the measles or the chickenpox or the cowpox, in a treatise by Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, writing from Iran in the 9th century, whose work spreads both in Arabic and ultimately also in Latin translation in Europe and in Persian translation in India, across much of Eurasia. By the time we get sort of detailed accounts of practices relating to smallpox, this sort of Islamic tradition represented by Razi with regard to describing the symptoms and treatment of smallpox, together with the indigenous South Asian traditions of understanding smallpox associated with practices related to the goddess Sitla, seem to sort of intermingle and influence each other, such that by the time European travelers are moving throughout South Asia in earnest, several travelers, especially in Eastern India and Bengal, record accounts of regional practices where in sort of ritual circumstances, a member of a Brahmin community, known as a tikadar, would expose children to small amounts of lymph from an infected pock in order to inoculate them against more severe contraction of the smallpox virus. Thus, even before the colonial period began, there existed local cultures of smallpox inoculation in pockets of India, which are likewise recorded elsewhere in Eurasia, specifically in Turkey, where Europeans encountered them and actually try to bring those sort of practices of inoculation back to Europe. But a major development in the treatment of smallpox occurred during the late 18th century in England, when the English physician Edward Jenner successfully developed a technique to inoculate the body against the smallpox virus through the use of another virus. Right? So this is different than what they were doing in India and in China and Turkey, where they were using parts of smallpox to inoculate against smallpox. Here, Jenner instead uses the cowpox virus to inoculate against smallpox. Cowpox is genetically related to smallpox, but unlike smallpox, has trivial effects, while smallpox obviously has very severe effects. This treatment became known as vaccination. This is the original vaccine and ushered in the first global movement toward disease eradication on the eve of the Napoleonic Wars and the establishment of what historians call the Second British Empire, that is, namely the British Empire as it existed after the American Revolution. Now, early vaccine delivery was a very complicated process. Refrigeration does not exist. There's a lack of means of preserving vaccine material that we all today take for granted. For this reason, transporting vaccine matter could only be done over very short distances. For that reason, the common practice was that vaccination would occur directly from the arm of one patient to the arm of another, right? Because anything that was removed from the arm of the first patient had a very, very short shelf life. The easiest way to ensure that the vaccine matter was viable was to administer it directly after it had been removed from the arm of the patient. Right. So this sometimes resulted, therefore, in situations which were not wholly sanitary and could result in inadvertent spread of other kinds of bloodborne illness, such as syphilis, such as leprosy, and so on. And in fact, the relatively large rate of co-occurrence of unwanted side effects from the lack of sanitation associated with vaccination led to the first anti-vax movement alongside and almost immediately beginning with the beginning of the vaccine movement itself. So here you can see a British publication, a colored engraving from the London Anti-Vaccination Society of 1802, parodying the delivery of the cowpox vaccine with individuals who are now literally breaking out in pox that appear as though they are cows. The story of the spread of vaccination from Europe to other parts of the colonized world is what I'll be talking about in just a moment. And I sort of debated whether or not I ought to, just show a photograph of an individual who is affected by smallpox. There are a lot of ethical sort of questions related to showing medical photographs taken in the context of empire. And so I chose not directly to show one of these photographs, but instead thought that I should just give this as an illustration of what smallpox vaccination looks like. On the one hand, on the left here, you can see a lancet, which was used for transferring viral matter, vaccine matter, from one arm to another. This lancet was apparently owned by Jenner himself. Basically looks like a small pocket knife. The idea is you use this to scrape a pustule from the donor of the vaccine material, then create a slight nick in the skin, a cut of the receiver, and thereby transfer the viral material from the body of the donor to the body of the receiver. On the right is an image from the modern campaign to eliminate smallpox in India from 1973. And I chose this image because I want to highlight the role of Indians themselves and their own agency in responding to campaigns to vaccinate and to inoculate the Indian public, and indeed in contributing to those campaigns. So here, this is an image from 1973, obviously not the early period of smallpox vaccination, but rather the end of smallpox vaccination, in which you can see a team of doctors from the World Health Organization on the right, showing a picture of a child infected with smallpox to a woman, asking if she knows of any individuals in her community who have ever been infected with this disease, to which she has the agency to respond and to tell them where someone like this might be within her community. And so I chose this both as a way of illustrating, what smallpox actually looks like, but also to highlight the role of Indians themselves in the spread of smallpox vaccination. All right, so how did smallpox vaccination reach India in the first place from Great Britain? Obviously, the journey in the early part of the 19th century from Britain to India was a complicated one. This is an age before the advent of steam travel. So the journey could take a very long time, several months in its sort of fastest iterations. It also depended upon the prevailing winds in the Arabian Sea, which could allow a ship to travel from the area of southern Iraq, say along the Gulf of Baluchistan, ultimately down to the port of Bombay. And so it is indeed sort of a remarkable story that the smallpox vaccine reached India with the rapidity that it did. In 1801, just a few years after the announcement of the success of the smallpox vaccine in India, the success of the smallpox vaccine in England, the governor of Bombay, Jonathan Duncan, sent requests through the East India Company to deliver vaccine material to Bombay because the disease was particularly deadly there. Early efforts to transport vaccine material overland through Europe and Anatolia to Mesopotamia, Iraq, failed, but eventually vaccine was sent to Baghdad in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, where it was used to inoculate an Armenian boy there in the city, who then became the source for a further transmission from Baghdad to Basra on the Persian Gulf. From Basra, vaccine material was sent across the Persian Gulf on a 3-week sea voyage to Bombay, right? After steam travel, this trip becomes very quick, but in the early 19th century, this is a 3-week sea voyage. The vaccine material is then used in an attempt to inoculate several children in Bombay immediately upon its arriving in the city. And by June of 1802, one Anglo-Indian child, namely Anna Dusthill, who had been inoculated with materials sent via Basra, showed signs of cowpox infection, meaning that the vaccine had successfully been conveyed to this child. this child, and the dust till then becomes the source for all subsequent vaccination that takes place in India, with individual groups of children taken from Bombay to Calcutta, to Madras, and to other parts of the Indian Mufassal. Here you can see from the Bombay Courier of July of 1802, just a month after the successful inoculation of this child and a dust till, a really enthusiastic account of the introduction of the vaccine. The British journalists covering the vaccine state that no expense has been spared by the East India Company in bringing vaccine material to India. And then ultimately that both Hindus and Parsis, both here in Bombay and in Surat, show the utmost desire of having their children inoculated with the vaccine disease. The article goes on to state that the British will now instruct native practitioners of medicine how to administer the vaccine and so on. And so a really optimistic account of vaccination here in July of 1802. And when I first started this project, I didn't think there were really going to be very many sources that I could use to sort of contextualize Mulla Firuz's account of the smallpox vaccine. That changed, however, when I was sort of preparing for this talk back in September, after I sent the abstract of the talk to Muhammad and to Miguel, in which I discovered a cache of digitized documents at the India Office Library relating to the introduction of smallpox to Bombay Presidency in the early 19th century. Fortunately, I was on the ball with doing this research and doing it in September because, as I think many of you know, the British Library more recently has been subject to a ransomware attack, and all of their digital documents are currently not accessible. But I'm very fortunate in downloading this back in September, this collection of documents relating to smallpox inoculation, which here you can see one part of this cache of documents, which gives us a sort of account of the number of vaccinations that occurred between the years 1812 and 1813. Which doesn't look too good for the Parsi community, right? During that year, 25,853 doses of vaccine were administered in Bombay Presidency, of which only a total of 293 vaccine doses have been administered to Parsis, less than, just around 1% of the total number of vaccines. And it turns out that this low rate of vaccination among the Parsi community was not simply because of the small total population figures of the Parsi community, but as the cache of documents reveals, it actually owed to a real distrust bordering on religious revulsion toward vaccination that prevailed among the Parsi community. In fact, the cache of documents also includes within it a account of a legal proceeding which took place in the city of Surat in 1806 against a Zoroastrian priest, a Dastur of the city, who was actively obstructing members of his community from receiving the vaccine. And so I want to start now just to look a little bit at what this case is, for what it reveals about traditional attitudes toward that might be what we might think of as traditional attitudes toward the practices that result in vaccination. Right. So here, copies of legal documents from Surat sent on to Bombay, which were then removed to the India office, which is where I found them. Right. Details of an obstruction which has taken place to the further progress of the vaccine inoculation among the Parsis of the city, is what this cache of documents professes to contain. These documents are, of course, handwritten in English, and as someone who is, mostly used to reading sort of paleographic Persian, the experience of having to read even very clear 19th century cursive handwriting is always sort of a humbling one. So I should say in the first instance that this project of reading through these documents was made immensely easier by uploading it to the website Transcribus, which produced a searchable optical character recognition document of this vast quantity of handwritten accounts in English. So here is a proceeding of the document. Here's a proceeding of the case against this Dastur. I'll sort of skip ahead here to just give you the easy to read version. Extract from the Magistracy Register of the Court of Adalat for Surat, Randair, etc. A representation was today received from the municipal surgeon of certain obstructions caused by one Barjorji Dastur living in Rustampura to the dissemination of the cowpox in that quarter. In consequence of previous verbal complaint on the same subject, the depositions of 3 persons had been taken, namely Adarji Khurshedji, Espandiarji Shaporji, and Khurshedji Koyaji. The first before the judge and magistrate, the other 2 by the coat walls, as there would be difficulty, the municipal surgeon stated, to prevail so far over their fears of the Dastur in question, as to induce them to give public testimony against him at the Adalat. The sum total information lodged by the municipal surgeon and these witnesses amounted to this charge, that the said Barjorji had actively exerted himself to prevent the Parsis submitting their children to the vaccine. In other words, he was trying to stop Parsis from bringing their children to the surgeon administering the vaccine. Inoculation was a practice incompatible with their religion, he said, and he had actually himself repaired to the spot where they had voluntarily assembled their children before the municipal surgeon for that purpose, and denounced the punishment of heretics on such as should submit their offspring to this operation. In other words, the Dastur would say that anyone who had their children vaccinated would be removed from the community and denounced as heretics. As a consequence of the above testimonies, the Dastur Barjorji was summoned to explain and justify the obstruction he had given by these doctrines to the progress of a benefit so invaluable to his own race and mankind at large. And so the case says that, okay, we're going to introduce Barjorji's own testimony as to why it was that he was trying to stop his co-religionists from vaccinating their children. Some more case here. It's a pretty long document, right? It goes on for about 40 pages. Again, I will allow you to cheat and not have to read the handwriting. Here is an excerpt from Barjorji's testimony. So Barjorji starts by saying that he first gets word that surgeons are introducing a new medical practice into Surat and encouraging Parsis in particular to undergo this practice. He then learns that this practice involves the transfer of lymph material, pus material from the arm of one person to another. He is distraught at hearing this because for him, this practice would violate his understanding of the purity practices of the Zoroastrian religion. He then writes to other members of his community, sends a letter to Navsari. In Navsari, they write back to him saying, indeed, his opinion is correct. And it's that leads him to go on to stop the inoculation. He says in his testimony, 3 days after this, I wrote a mahzar signed by 25 persons. This is a kind of Persian document, a mahzar, which we know from large collections of documents elsewhere. I couldn't find this particular document, but we have many of them. And we sent it to the Navsari Dasturs, who wrote back for answer that what I had told the doctor was the truth, namely about the impermissibility of vaccination, but that it rested with the magistrate sometime after this. The non-Pura priests who are of my sect came to me. They were about to have their children vaccinated and asked if it was conformable with the tenets of the religion or not. I answered them that the Navsari priest was come to Surat and to go and ask him. They accordingly went to him. His name is Nasirwanji. And he told them that it was not conformable, and that the sinful contamination of matter of human blood and of dog, alive or dead, was explained in books titled Se Patate, which I assume is just the Patates, the confessions in Pazand, and the Bundesh, which must be the Bundehishan, and in the Pahlavi of the Avesta of Zoroastrian or Zoroaster, as will clearly appear on inspection. Then, remarkably, the legal documents even include those texts that the priest enters into evidence together with their translations into English. This is, of course, remarkable because in 1806, we're really talking about an early period in the European understanding of Zoroastrianism. This is a period, just after Anquetil Duperron has returned to France, and before really even, the early sort of Orientalist accounts of, of the Zoroastrian community among sort of the British populations of Bombay. So before John Wilson even has arrived in India, long before Haug and West and all of those scholars. So this is a pretty early account of Zoroastrian texts, in other words. Namely, the eating or touching or bearing or or putting into fire or water, sorry for the spacing here, or putting fire or water on them, anything from the body of a dead or a live man or a dog is in our religion highly forbidden, improper, and sinful. But if from ignorance such a crime should take place, it may be in the first instances by certain prayers and repentance expiated. Sorry for that formatting. Repetition cannot, however, be atoned for in the same way, and the perpetrator is deserving of punishment. This is presumably taken from a sort of an interpretation of the Patate, actually. And then the document goes on to describe these sources, what they are. The Patate says the author of this book was a Dastur named Adarbad Marsband, who lived during the reign of Ardashir Babur Khan. I think Babur Khan's really cute for Baba Khan, obviously, but they've turned him into sort of a Mughal by calling him Babur Khan. As well as the Bandesh and the Avesta. So, by now, this, to me as a scholar of Zoroastrianism, looks like a pretty, standard kind of traditional response to the question of whether or not a Zoroastrian can come into contact or not with dead matter. Indeed, we have many texts from a variety of Zoroastrian sources in a variety of languages, which suggests that. Already the Videvdad, says, and I won't go into too much detail here because I think the audience is largely familiar with this, but that on the one hand, the evil spirit, Ahriman, is responsible for the creation of disease, right? The villain made against me, namely Ahura Mazda, 99 diseases, 9,900 and 90,000, he, the evil spirit, full of destruction, etc., etc. Videvdad also says, how will those men be purified, O Ahura Mazda? Those who have eaten from carrion of a dead dog or a man. Note the parallels between this passage and what we saw in the evidence from Barjorji. Ahura Mazda says, they will not be purified, O orderly Zarathustra. Those men should be cut to the heart. Those men, one should, punish them. This lie demon, the corpse, will then rush upon their nails. Afterward, they become impure forever and eternity, right? So contact with dead matter is bad in Zoroastrian early texts, which is something that later texts continue to emphasize. Here is from an excerpt of an early medical treatise in Persian that I worked on with my student Tommy Benfi, a text called the Raste of Dadar Ibn Dadhucht, which alleges to detail an encounter between a Zoroastrian priest at the Sasanian court and Greek physicians coming from the Byzantine court during the reign of Shapur, from the Roman court during the reign of Shapur, in which the Zoroastrian priest Dadar tells the Greek physicians that everything that they know about medicine originates from the fact that the Greeks conduct autopsies on dead bodies. He says, it used to be that anyone who had a long illness and for whom there was no hope would be euthanized. When they died, they would be put into a tub of vinegar and olive oil to preserve their body, and their belly would be opened up and their veins and members dissected. But thereby would become clear to you what ailment that person had. But in our religion, in the Zoroastrian religion, it is not permitted so much as to look at a dead or a slain body, let alone to touch a corpse. We consider the corpse to be polluted, and we do not take account of it since it's a great sin, right? So even in medical treatises originating in the Zoroastrian community in late antiquity and the medieval period, this is prohibited to conduct autopsy. Zoroastrian priests of the medieval period were exposed to medical knowledge from a wide variety of traditions. Here is a manuscript in Old Gujarati copied by a Parsi Khurshedji, son of Navrozji, in the 18th century, for instance, illustrating Indian medicine and Hatha yoga practices on the Zoroastrian community, such that by the early modern period, the sort of combined exposure to Islamic and to Indian medicine led, on the one hand, to a high degree of awareness of other medical practices that existed, and also to a question of whether those practices could be adopted. Here, a letter written from India to Iran in the early 16th century. If someone tells a layperson to eat dead matter for the sake of a remedy or a cure, that order should not be obeyed, as it says in the Videvda. The punishment for any person who has eaten dead matter is that his abode and belongings should be destroyed and his heart should be cut out of his body. Right? This is a pretty, severe kind of punishment that the Videvda lays down for this person, and he will be in hell for all eternity unless he's brought before the religious leaders and the high priests. But there are some places in which there are exceptions made with regard to the use of matter that in one way or another is associated with evil creatures. For instance, much of early Zoroastrian texts describe insects, creepy crawly bugs and the like, as being in some way or another part of the creation of the evil spirit of Ahriman. But one sees, for instance, in the Persian Revoyats, again, letters from India to Iran, places in which insect products are allowed because of a kind of divine intercession with regard to these creatures. So a question, for instance, arises whether people can wear silk or whether they can eat honey, of course, both products of insects. The answer, Ahriman the accursed has produced the silkworm and the bee for doing harm to the creation of Ormazd and for the destruction of trees, but also Ormazd has in his wisdom produced benefit from those creatures for the good of his creation. Thus, the beehive should be purified and made ready. They should wash their hands and extract honey from the beehive. This is proper if it is eaten as medicine or for effecting a cure. Right? So there is some sort of grounds, even within the early modern materials, whereby one might find places as a theologian to make some wiggle room with regard to something like vaccine, right? Well, okay, maybe even Ormazd creates benefit in things that are otherwise impure. This is what brings us now to Mulla Firuz and to his treatise in the last part of my talk. Already this cache of documents mentions Mulla Firuz, right, as having been employed specifically to respond to the priest Barjorji in Surat, who had been obstructing his fellow Parsis from vaccinating. Blah, blah, blah. We have to notice with satisfaction the example set by Mulla Firuz. Maulana Firuz, I guess they were saying, a learned Parsi priest residing on the island of Bombay, who has endeavored to encourage the members of that tribe to adopt vaccination and presented government with a treatise on the subject in the year 1806, which we do not, however, find on the records, the original translation having been sent to the purpose of allaying the violent prejudices of the caste, as already averted to in the 144th preceding paragraph, blah, blah, blah. And so here is a mention of that treatise that Ursula Sims-Williams had emailed me about back in 2011. And I will, in the interest of time, maybe skip through a couple of slides, which we can come back to. Mulla Firuz famously traveled with his father as a young man from India to Iran at the age of 8 in the year the age of 10 in the year 1768. He was instructed in the Zoroastrian religion in Yazd and in Kerman, where you can see him, for instance, talking about learning both the ritual of the yasna and also learning the Videvda, the Bandidad. I won't read the whole quotes here. He was also, through his father, exposed to Iranian scientists. His father was an astronomer, someone who could successfully, according to the sources, predict future events from the stars. Here, a brief account of his father being able to predict the end of the Zand siege of Basra, successful, battle between the Iranian armies and the Ottomans, whereby Mulla Firuz's father, Qaus, ultimately becomes the chief astrologer for the court of the Zand king in Shiraz. Here is a imperial Zand history, Gulshan-e-Morad, which talks about the place of Mulla Firuz's father, Qaus, whom the text describes as Magian or Zoroastrian by origin, as the chief astrologer of the government of justice. Among other things, Mulla Qaus was responsible for calculating the time in which the construction of the Vakil Mosque of Shiraz should be begun. Right, so this beautiful structure that you can still see, of course, today, standing in Iran as one of the major tourist sites in Shiraz, was in some way or another connected to Mulla Firuz's father's scientific prowess of knowing when a good time to start a building project was. At any rate, Mulla Firuz eventually leaves Iran with his father, and though they originally want to travel to Istanbul, winds up coming back to Bombay. He describes his leaving of Iran like the exile of Adam from the Garden of Eden, or like the imprisonment of the ancient Iranian king Qaus and Mazandaran. That Firuz leaving the paradisical land in his eyes of Iran was somehow a major letdown in his life. That becomes relevant in a moment, as we'll see, as Mulla Firuz begins to see the British of the city of Bombay as his patrons in the same way that his father had previously been patronized by the king of Iran. Mulla Firuz becomes, following his father, the high priest of the Dadiset Atesh Behram in the city of Mumbai, the first of the highest grade fire temple in Bombay city. And as such, he becomes a major religious authority for the Zoroastrian community there, even after rival Zoroastrian communities build their own high-grade fire temples. Mulla Firuz still has a kind of primacy even among non-Qadimi priests, even among Shahanshāhi priests, owing to this sort of great degree of learning that he has. It's my very, very short version of finally getting to this treatise on smallpox at the British Library. Here's what it looks like. Apologies for my ugly fingers at the bottom of this slide. Right, it's a treatise written in a very sort of small, neat hand. I said it's Shikaste. It's not really Shikaste. It's sort of Shikaste Almies, or it's sort of half Shikaste kind of script. Written in a very, very flowery kind of Persian language, trying to argue for the permissibility of smallpox vaccination among Zoroastrians. May it be neither concealed nor hidden to the possessors of sound nature and genius, or to the masters of right intellect and understanding, they who are the investigators of the path of the religion and the accountants of the way of the correct custom, who with the deft fingers of their ancient thoughts untie the knots of the noble nation and Abrahamic law of the Zoroastrians. Well, these texts always start with a way over the top introduction. The great physicians of that exalted population and noble people, the English, after great exertion and uncountable reflection, spending from their treasuries beyond the furthest limit, trading in treasures beyond the power of enumeration, have successfully and for the common benefit come to prevent variola, jodari, commonly known as smallpox, chichak, whenever they choose and at any time they desire. Like the miracles of the heirs of divine felicity, they revive the dead as though it were the second coming of the breath of the Messiah. This is really, kind of over the top praise of British science as being able to eliminate smallpox whenever they choose. Like any good treatise in Persian, the treatise is filled with poetry. Mulla Firuz tells us that it's his own poetry. It's not borrowed from anyone else, but he says, tales of the fountain of life are merely legend and myth, despite the effort that poor Alexander took in looking for it. The water of life is you. Normally one would interpret this as God, but here it's pretty obvious that Mulla Firuz means the English. And your pure nature is the spring. The tree of life bears fruit only thanks to you. Okay, so thus far, just some, kind of, Persian, polite, for lack of a better word, butt kissing here on the part of Mulla Firuz. But we'll get to the interesting part in just a minute, which he tries to now argue for why Zoroastrians should, in fact, adopt vaccination. Thanks to the brimming streams of this canal of divine effulgence, which in its life-nurturing quality is the envy of the water of paradise entering into the blessed port of Surat, a great number of innocent children were saved by this beneficial action and freed from the various torments and tribulations of the pox. But one of the residents of Rustampura, known as Dastur Barjorji, son of the late Dastur Khurshedji, this is the same guy that we just read about as having that trial, forbade and held back the Parsis of the aforementioned Pura, the aforementioned neighborhood, with some religious proofs concerning pollution. The Persian word is hiddar, which indeed have no connection to his intention or proximity to his goal. Concerning this, here are a few lines of Pahlavi, Ozvaresh, which in their underlying meaning disclose a proof concerning exigency. And the word used here is the Arabic word zarura. And zarura is a category in Islamic law of situations in which it is permissible to do things that are otherwise impermissible, right? The classic case in Islamic law is it is not a crime for a starving man to steal bread because otherwise he would die. And so here are some Pahlavi lines which express this Zoroastrian principle, according to Mulla Firuz, of situations in which exigency comes into play. Here again, you can see Mulla Firuz's text in which the Pahlavi is transcribed in Pahlavi, and here translation. First, in the Zoroastrian religion, it's recorded that extinguishing a fire is one of the greatest sins. And this is known to all Zoroastrians to be one of the first principles of the religion. But in cases of exigency, putting out a fire is better, as is recorded. And then a line comes from the Denkard. Of course, Mulla Firuz is, at this point, the owner of the B. Denkard manuscript, and is in some way or another the father of Denkard studies. Ein is ku atach shne ozanishin chevana, aske ozened we. This too, one should not extinguish a fire, for it's a sin. But there are those who say, or maybe there are those situations in which extinguishing it is good. That's all it says, right? But I think we can all sort of imagine situations in which putting out a fire is a good thing rather than a bad thing, such as when your house is burning down. Second, this in Persian first, giving something to evil people and sinners is a sin, but sometimes giving is good. This too is manifest that one should not give things to evildoers. Ein is pedog kutiso wataron medahishin, would ask a pahlon khwashtar khwardig o wataron dahishin. But there are times when one should give the best and most delicious food to evildoers, presumably also in cases in which individuals are starving, right, in which you need to give food in order to preserve life. That's all the Pahlavi text says, but Mulla Firuz derives from those Pahlavi texts, from the Denkard, a principle that there are situations in which one has to act in accordance with exigency, with zarura. To those who understand inner meaning and who are aware of truth, who weigh the measure of speech in the scales of able knowledge, it is not hidden that the writing of these two passages, even if they do not directly pertain to the matter at hand, these obviously have nothing to do directly with vaccination, nevertheless have been recorded so that it be known that the lawgivers of foundations of all nations, having established rules for the government of the world and healing for the affairs of mankind, have given permission in conformity with the exigencies of time to commit certain otherwise non-praiseworthy deeds. Right? So this is Mulla Firuz's way of building a case within Zoroastrianism for violating purity laws in order to preserve life. Right? That is to say, the preservation of life outweighs the sin that would accrue from a violation of purity law. This is a Zoroastrian principle of exigency, and ultimately what I argue is a principle of pragmatism that he is outlining here. One last quote, towards the end of the text, before I come to a conclusion. Ultimately, the text goes on to argue that the life of children is dear and is, in many ways dearer even than the life of adults, and that allowing children to die in great numbers, as is the case with smallpox, is itself a great moral failing of the community. So the text concludes after a long discussion from the Videvdad about the fact that we are all sinners because we all occasionally do not dispose of hair in the correct way, text concludes with the following: with what proof and from what book have the authorities of Navsari allowed that evil deed of allowing children to die of smallpox, such that they do not forbid and admonish their followers from committing it? What they are doing is commanding wrong and forbidding right. This again is borrowed from Islamic jurisprudence, where, of course, one is supposed to command right and forbid wrong, to forbid smallpox inoculation in the new manner. For next to that sin, namely the sin of the death of children, the sin of vaccination vanishes like a drop in the ocean and like a speck of dust in the ray of the sun. Such examples are enough for the knowledgeable, and this is where Mulla Firuz concludes his treatise on smallpox vaccination. Again, it's a short text. There's not much evidence that it was widely read during its time, but it is a basis by which an argument can be made for the pragmatic application rather than the literal application of Zoroastrian law. Just really quickly come to some final slides here. I argue that this sort of adoption of pragmatic principles by Zoroastrians during this period of the late 18th and early 19th century is part of a broader move among Zoroastrian scholars of that period, the period which immediately precedes the period in which Zoroastrians heavily interact with Western Orientalists, that allows a sort of new kind of rationalism and pragmatism to take hold in the Parsi community, such that by the time of the mid-century, the Parsi community is fully prepared in terms of the way in which they can now talk about modern technologies to adopt pragmatically both Western approaches to education and to other spheres of influence. Here, for instance, is Parsi Gujarati translation of Thomas Paine's Age of Reason into Gujarati, which is made, just a few years really after the death of Mulla Firuz. So I'm going to conclude here. What I've tried to do in this presentation is to try to complicate the narrative of Zoroastrians in the 19th century of merely adopting wholesale British technology and British, forms of knowledge with regard both to their religion and with regard to the worlds around them, and to restore to them some agency in trying to think through the impact of modernity using the tools of their religion to justify selective and pragmatic encounters with modernity. Ultimately, of course, the story of the Zoroastrian eventual acceptance of vaccination is a part of a broader narrative of global health. It's not to say, of course, that the introduction of vaccination into India was a wholly benevolent process. It enables, new forms of colonial control and restriction in being able, for instance, to inoculate the East India Company army against disease and thereby make them more effective soldiers in containing other forms of committing other forms of violence within the subcontinent. But nevertheless, today, this interaction between Zoroastrians and Western medicine has resulted in what is undoubtedly a public good in India, namely the elimination of smallpox within the nation and within the globe, and also in the introduction of new vaccines throughout the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. Thanks so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheffield, for this amazing, very, very interesting talk and full of sources and a lot of points of common interest for many people, for sure. And please, we will have a few minutes for questions. So 3-4 questions. Anyone in the audience? You can please raise your hands or open your microphone. Irdush Mehta, please.
Hello, Dr. Sheffield.
Hi, Firuz.
Fantastic presentation. And I'm so sad that only 52 people plus you are on the screen today. I would have loved to see 53,000 people on the screen. So appropriate to today's world that I've come across a couple of young people who have decided not to take the COVID vaccine, even at the cost of losing their jobs with the federal Canadian government, who has made the requirement that we do. And I was asked as to what our scriptures would say in terms of should vaccine be taken or not. And my simple answer was, which scripture are you talking about? Are you talking about Zarathustra's Gothic scripture, or are you talking about the Sasanian Pahlavi scripture? Answers will be different if you look at the two things. So I'm glad that you pointed this out as a matter of the Sasanian Pahlavi later literature. I'm surprised that nowadays we kind of put it all in a lump of Zoroastrian. I don't think the Sasanian Pahlavi has anything to do with Zarathustra as such. So maybe some demarcation needs to be developed.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's an important point. I mean, I think, as part of the broader argument, I'm interested in basically how, the Zoroastrian community came to think about the Gathas as separate, because everything was inherited together. In the 19th century, like in the 18th and 19th century, this scholastic tradition, had been passed down, in which, of course, the Gathas are copied in the context of, Vandidad Sade manuscripts and in the context of Yasna manuscripts. So obviously, a major shift happened in the community in which the community, rather than Western Orientalists, began to think of the Gathas of Zarathustra as separate from that corpus. This, can be termed discovery depending on your perspective. But I argue that this kind of pragmatic thinking that Mulla Firuz is already doing before that discovery has been made allows the community really to start thinking about the Gathas in new ways during the 1860s and 1870s when the sort of Gatha movement begins. So, I think it's all part of the same discourse, really, as thinking of the scholastic tradition as somehow, historicized rather than as just one undifferentiated thing. Yeah, so thank you for that point.
Thank you. I still stand by my thinking that we should come up with a different way of calling them. Not lump everything as Zoroastrian.
That's fine. I mean, if you want to call the Pahlavi tradition as scholastic, I'm totally fine with that, and other kinds of Zoroastrian thinking as non-scholastic. That's
no, I didn't say scholastic or non-scholastic, okay? Both are scholastic.
Yeah, I don't mean to say they're not scholarly. I mean to say that they are, it's part of a tradition of priests who are, of course, going back to the Sasanian period.
Then we can call it Gothic.
Sorry, we can just have one question because otherwise we will lead to a totally different discussion. So
his answers are leading to other questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're right. Gothic is a fine term for that.
Thank you. Any other question, please? Because we are running out of time. That's why I'm sorry.
It's my fault for being so long-winded.
No. I mean, it was a pleasure listening to you. Armaiti, please.
Thank you. Thank you for a really informative talk, Dr. Sheffield. I think for me, what's really salient here is that even a couple of 100 years ago, our community was looking at things objectively and as choice, but also relying on background and belief to make informed decisions. And I think no matter what, we need to continue to still question the rhetoric. We have to still question things that are presented to us and look at not only historical context, but our own selves when being asked to make choices about our health. So I don't want to get into the politics about all of it, but I love that our ancestors were still questioning things. And I like how you brought up that idea that we didn't just take things whole from the British, and that we actually stood back a little and questions things, whether we agree with what they did or not, and what that outcome was. So thank you so much for delving into a different part of history that I was never aware of before.
Well, thanks for paying such close attention to the talk. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Armaiti. Another question? Last question? Among the audience, we have one in the chat. I will be very quick. It is evident that some religious authorities oppose new medical astronomical inventions, engage in recurrent scientific debates. Could you kindly share your thoughts on the specific discourse that oppose vaccination?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, within any, kind of paradigm shift, there are, many different reactions to that, that moment. And I think that, there are, real reasons why people, were cautious surrounding the introduction of vaccines in the early part of the 19th century. That is that, not only did they entail the dissolution of purity laws, but by consequence also a kind of dissolution of like the priestly structures that that those were important for, and also were, in certain cases at least, connected to the spread of other kinds of diseases. I mentioned syphilis as occasionally being associated with outbreaks related to vaccinations. It's not really an easy thing, to say, who is right and who is wrong with regard to the broader question of modernity, right? That is to say, modernity has its ups and its downs. It enables, forms of violence, but it also prevents forms of disease and other forms of suffering. So it is rather my intention here just to show that there is agency here, that there were real arguments that were made, on real kinds of bases, that that they had public health consequences, as well as other kinds of economic consequences, and I hope to leave the sort of moral decision to the audience, as to like what they take of this, because at the same time, there are declines of like traditional practices. As a new practice is introduced, an old practice goes out of fashion. The British government, quite unjustly, really did actually try to proscribe traditional practices of variolation, where that was actually being used in an effective way in order to replace their own practices of vaccination. So, there are certain cases in which preferring one kind of vaccination over another probably did lead to conflict and possibly even to loss of life. But at any rate, as a historian here, it's sort of more my goal to sort of document and think with these sources about new ways of moving beyond like the confines of modernity in the future, rather than like evaluating the sort of morality of the historical communities I study.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much, Professor Sheffield, for this very, very interesting talk. Thank you for the audience for attending, of course. Thank you to the audience. And we will finish the session now. So Professor Tavakoli, please.
Professor Sheffield, brilliant presentation. I greatly appreciate it, particularly since, as you know, I work on early modernity. This is really a canonical text that could engage with a whole lot of other things, both before and after. Thank you for presenting it. And I look forward to seeing a published article in Persian on it with the reprinting of the text. If you are interested, we could publish it in Iran-Nama.
I would be more than happy to do that. In fact, I have the Persian text transcribed.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, I'll
be in touch.
That'd be fun.
Awesome.
Okay. All righty.
And it's great seeing you.
Everyone. Okay.
Have a lovely day.
All righty.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah.
We see you next month. And happy holidays to all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.